As we approach the end of 2023, one thing that many in agriculture thought would happen this year that hasn't is a new farm bill.
The farm bill attracts, this outsized attention. It's carrying some baggage that that probably was not envisioned, 80 to 100 years ago when this process was started.
That's Dr. Bart Fisher, who spent 8 years with the House Agriculture Committee and today is a professor of ag policy at Texas A&M. The lack of a farm bill brought up a lot of questions for me about this legislation, like what are the impacts of not having this bill in place, what causes these types of delays, and are these farm bills, which have been around since the 1930s, even still relevant?
It's just incredibly important for the productive capacity of this country that we maintain a safety net for growers because it costs so much to produce.
Bart gives me quite an education about the past, present, and future of the Farm Bill. We talk about some of the nuances to getting these bills passed and what goes into these farm bills, from support programs to crop insurance to conservation and beyond. And we cover the impacts of the policies on farmers and rural economies.
Farm bills aren't written for the good times, they're written for the bad times. One of the challenges, though, is that even though they're written for the bad times, they're often written during the good times.
The Farm Bill episode you didn't know you needed with Dr. Bart Fisher on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Hello, fellow ag nerd. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture. My name is Tim Hamrich, and every week you and I get to hear from the founders, farmers, innovators, and investors, the people shaping the future of the ag industry. Now, before we dive in, I want to thank our quarterly presenting sponsor, which is a company that tells you what you don't want to know. Every 3 seconds, FarmWave's Harvest Vision system is counting your harvest losses off the header and from the combine and reporting them to you in the cab in real time. Make changes on the fly and watch your loss counts drop without having to stop or do manual harvest loss counts again. Models are currently available in corn and soybeans with several other crops in development for release soon. But don't take my word for it. Listen to an actual FarmWave customer.
I had firsthand experience with it. It proved itself right out the gate the first minute we started running it. That is hard to argue with. When you see something instantly showing you a return, there's something to it. And then it's done it we've done it multiple times. Would I like to get through a season without it showing me anything? Yeah, that'd be great. It means I'm doing it right, but it's also nice having that safety net that if something, when you get into the end of the season, you're maybe not checking everything the way you should, or you just assume everything's adjusted correctly or it's running right. Well, this is going to tell you otherwise if you do have something that's not right.
Join the ranks of farmers deploying Harvest Vision in their fields to ensure no bushel gets left behind. Put AI to work on your farm. Just visit farmwave.io to chat with one of their experts or locate a dealer near you. Thank you so much to FarmWave for supporting farm innovation and the Future of Agriculture podcast. All right, now back to today's episode with Dr. Bart Fisher. Bart is a research assistant professor and the co-director of the Agricultural and Food Policy Center in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Texas A&M University. His applied research focuses on solving real-world policy problems for agricultural producers and on anticipating potential policy changes for Congress to consider. Before joining Texas A&M, Fisher served for more than 8 years on the House Agriculture Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was involved in every major agricultural policy development in Washington, D.C. over those 8 years, including the 2014 and the 2018 Farm Bills. He's the fifth generation to be raised on his family's wheat, cotton, and cattle operation in southwest Oklahoma, and he continues to be actively involved there. For those of you who may not be super familiar with the Farm Bill, as a general definition, it's a comprehensive law that is hopefully passed every 5 years to provide an opportunity for policymakers to address agricultural and food issues, which, as you know from listening to the show, are always changing and evolving. So it makes sense that our policymakers would take a look at this and periodically review what's necessary for food security and for the future of agriculture and food in this country. We're going to reference in this interview a few titles of the Farm Bill by number. So if you don't have those fresh on your mind, I'll just give you a bit of a glossary here. Specifically, we're going to talk about Title I, which is known as the commodities title of the Farm Bill. These are all of the price support and income support programs for the most widely produced commodities. Think corn, soy, wheat, etc. So price support, meaning the government would put like a floor in price to help support the markets so that farmers can remain viable and in business, or income support when needed for more direct payments and ways to support the income of those who produce our food. We'll also talk about Title II, which includes conservation programs, and Title IV, which is focused on nutrition, and the SNAP program, which some of you might know is formerly known as food stamps. All right, so that's enough context. Just know those titles. Title I, commodity programs, so price and income support. Title II, conservation. Title IV, nutrition. I think I got those right. I'll drop into the conversation here where Bart is talking about how the Farm Bill has evolved over time, what he's learned from the research he's doing while writing the book he's currently writing about the history of the House Ag Committee, and why he believes the Farm Bill is still very relevant today.
In my time on the Hill, I mean, I hear it all the time, right? It's time to scrap a Farm Bill because it's mired in New Deal policies from the 1930s, responding to the Great Depression, right? And I've had people come into my office when I was on the Hill saying it. I've read it in articles, news articles. I've heard members of Congress quoting it, in opposition to farm bills. And just that one alone to me has been fascinating to see just how much things have changed over the last 100 years. It's actually been pretty remarkable, to the point where, we started this exercise with the federal government, in a very heavy-handed way, weighing in controlling what producers were producing, and then, pretty severely impacting the market on the price support side, where we've, completely shifted in perspective to where the federal government is fairly hands-off, attempting to provide risk management tools, but otherwise letting the market clear. And all of that, largely started shifting in the mid-1990s with, when Senator Roberts, then chairman of the House Ag Committee, wrote his farm bill. And so, that is one where it's very easy at the 30,000 foot level to lob all of these accusations at farm bills. But if you actually study the history and know what you're talking about, you realize that a lot of the folks who are making those accusations have, no idea what they're talking about. I mean, another example too is just, the battles we have nowadays are very similar to the ones, they had then. And, if you look around, kind of the 1950s, for example, where you had control going back between Republicans and Democrats, and it was really following the 1954 Farm Bill, where you had Republicans ended up in the wilderness for 40 years. And a lot of it was in blowback to the way policymakers responded to the events of the day then, where you had Democrats in charge for almost 4 decades. And one that was interesting to me, and I don't know if anyone listening will have ever heard of it before or not, but one proposal at the time from the Secretary of Ag then, the Brannan Plan, Secretary Brannan, who worked for President Truman, he proposed this radical shift at the time when they were working on what we now call the Permit Act, the 1949 Farm Bill. Well, the Brannan Plan in 49 that he had proposed was this significant shift. And if you start to dig into the details and look at it, it was really arguing an income support approach, to farm policy, where instead of the government controlling, setting these price supports and then, pulling in all of these stocks to support the price and having a bunch of surplus hanging over the market, his proposal was let the market work and pay the difference, which is eerily similar to the policies that we had in place post 1996. And so he is, probably a good 40 years ahead of his time. And so for me, it's just fascinating to look back, at examples like that, where, we sit here today on any given topic, right? And we think that, well, the situation we're dealing with right now has never happened, or, it's different than it was in the past. No, we've been dealing with the same sort of issues. And the question is, do we learn from them or not? And so to me, that was one example. It was pretty neat. As part of writing the book, we went through all the archives of the committee. During COVID, we couldn't get into the archives, so they sent the archives back to the committee, and we spent several days in Washington pouring through all of it. And there I am holding the original Brannan Plan with the secretary's signature on it from 70 years ago. So for policy nerds like me, that was fascinating. It may not be to folks listening, but for a guy who spends every day thinking about foreign policy, it was pretty neat.
Yeah, and I think this question could be relevant to today, which is, what drives the timing of the farm bill in terms of, we thought we were going to have a farm bill this year as we talked today, November 8th. Maybe we're not going to have one this year. What factors are at play here that influence how long it takes to get a farm bill, and what might accelerate it into happening?
Great question, Tim. And you can get me on my soapbox quickly on this topic, because there's a lot that goes into it. So without completely going down the rabbit hole here, it's farm bills are very interesting animals, right? I mean, we do them since 1965, we've been doing them, as 5-year bills. Every single farm bill is really just we suspend permanent law. Back in the 1938, 1949 farm bills, those are the permanent laws. Ever since then, we write a farm bill that temporarily suspend those laws for 5 years. But agriculture is very unique in that regard. Much of the federal government's on autopilot. These programs don't have to be reauthorized. And in the case of agriculture, the argument all along has been, well, we need to do this every 5 years to stay current, right? To keep up with the times. That has been the impetus behind doing these 5-year omnibus farm bills, because without them, we'll revert, the threat of reverting to parity prices under permanent legislation. And so to some degree, the timing is a function of how these have been set up, for almost 100 years now, right? And it's every 5 years we go through this exercise. And it is, again, it's very unique compared to a lot of the rest of the federal government. I think the challenge nowadays is, because it's one of the few things that moves through Congress on a regular basis, it attracts all of this extra attention. For example, from a budget perspective, you'll see all sorts of amendments to cut farm policy that I'll sit there scratching my head wondering, where in the world is this coming from? But if nothing else is moving through Congress and you have members who are concerned about, the fiscal path that our country is on, well, here's a vehicle for them to look to a farm bill. And so the farm bill attracts, this outsized attention that I think is partly just a function of how it's all set up to work. And so it's carrying some baggage that that probably was not envisioned, 80 to 100 years ago when this process was started. But nonetheless, it is what it is now. And so, I mean, if you take, for example, you mentioned, the current farm bill. We've just seen in the House, a struggle to even get a continuing resolution finished. Essentially kick the can at last year's spending levels. It was a struggle to get that done. We only got it done short term through the 17th of November. You can then imagine the struggle of getting a 5-year omnibus bill with a price tag in the neighborhood of $1.5 trillion finished, right? And so you just have all of these things at play now, which, we can save another podcast for, okay, well, what do you do about all of that? Because I think there are some, we could rethink how we do farm bills, but, given how we have done, the last 15 of them or so, we've just been on this cycle. And again, in principle, it makes sense, right? The ag economy is constantly changing. You have constant pressure in the countryside, changing dynamics. You want the farm bill to be reflective of that. Unfortunately, I think the last several cycles has been more reflective of, well, how can we cut or do with less? And I would much prefer to come at it from a perspective of, what risk management tools do farmers really need to stay in business out on the countryside and to keep our country fed? And so you've got those two things in conflict right now, and you see it playing out. It makes it very, very difficult to get farm bills done.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what is the general consensus as you hear from farmers and other people with kind of vested interest in farm programs of, is the current farm bill doing a sufficient job of providing those risk management tools?
You could look at it a couple of ways, Tim. I think in terms of structure, the answer would be absolutely. That it works fine, right? You've got this set up now where, crop insurance is the cornerstone of the farm safety net. And we'll use a farm bill to make improvements to crop insurance, but crop insurance is independent of a farm bill. It's authorized in the Federal Crop Insurance Act of 1980. So crop insurance is sitting out there permanently authorized on its own. And so what we really use the farm bill for then is Title I of a farm bill. We're really looking to use it as a sort of a counterbalance to crop insurance. And you take both of those policy suites in tandem, and they're intentionally designed to work together. On one hand, if market prices are doing well, you're at or above break even, and you've got insurance where you can, insure that price and yield, you can survive the year fine. It's what do you do if you end up in a downturn like we saw, coming out of the 2014 Farm Bill and prices are, at the floor. Yes, insurance is still important. And yes, your banker and others are going to require you to purchase insurance in that case too, but you're well below break even. And so that's where Title One's, designed to step in. It runs essentially counter cyclical to crop insurance. And so in terms of structure, I think the structure works very well, right? Those two things working together. Certainly we can always tweak, but I think the structure works fine. I think the biggest part of that in question mark when you talk to growers is the levels. Are the levels at the right place? And so this Farm Bill is very much a conversation about, particularly in Title One of the Farm Bill, it's about reference prices, particularly on the price loss coverage program. Are those reference prices high enough? And I think resoundingly the answer is no, and primarily because of what it costs to produce these days. And that has shifted significantly since the 2018 Farm Bill was put into place. And so I think you've got the structure from 14 and 18 that still work fine. But then, the 18 Farm Bill in terms of levels, certainly it, did not envisage, a global pandemic that resulted in supply chain chaos and an explosion in inflation, right? And so I think this Farm Bill is all going to be about, I don't see a huge interest in changing the structure. I think it's much more about, fine tuning the levels of support. The challenge is that comes on one hand, that makes things a lot easier. On the flip side is that's what costs money, raising those levels. And that's why you see this ongoing conversation about, well, where's the money going to come from to pay for it?
Absolutely. Yeah, and along similar lines, we saw in the Inflation Reduction Act the interest in climate smart agriculture and investing in climate smart agriculture. Could the Farm Bill be another vehicle for doing that? And if so, would that show up in a structural change or just a levels change when it comes to something like, I don't know, CRP program or something?
I think there's a couple of ways to look at that as well. I'm a pretty strong believer in, the conservation investments we make and the farm safety net investments that we make, that there's a place, a unique place for both of those. And I think when we've tried to intertwine the two, we get in trouble. Historically, we used to do that. I mean, from the very earliest days, the old soil conservation bill in 1936 was, even back then, we were using conservation in tandem with supply controls. And so, we've moved on from those days. And to me, your conservation-minded incentive programs run separate from the farm safety net, although we're starting to see a blending of those two, which on the surface may make some sense, but to me is a bit of a red flag, because I think, it's just incredibly important for the productive capacity of this country that we maintain a safety net for growers, because it costs so much to produce. And my worry is those who would like to replace that with conservation aren't really concerned about the safety net aspect of that. And I think it leaves growers in a pretty precarious position. So against that backdrop of keeping them separate, then I do think that, if you look at this Farm Bill, you invoked IRA. The IRA funding is short term, and we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. But the bottom line is that spending, it has to be out the door from USDA by 2031. They had a finite period. And so there's this debate now about, well, will the IRA be, will that funding be brought inside of a Farm Bill? And my argument is, if you don't bring it inside of a Farm Bill, it's dead in 2031. That additional, $20 billion in budget authority that was offered in the IRA, it goes bye-bye come 2031. And we're already getting closer and closer to that point. And so if you want it to live on beyond that, it has to be a Farm Bill conversation. I think the concern a lot of observers have, and policymakers here at the table, is, okay, well, are you going to use that funding as a piggy bank to pay for other things? Or are you going to, use it to pay for conservation? Well, my argument is if it's not a Farm Bill conversation, you're guaranteeing that it doesn't survive between 2031. So that's the first threshold question. Is, to me, it has to be a Farm Bill conversation. Beyond that, then, I think policymakers can decide where the priority should lie, right? I struggle with, when you look at Title II of the Farm Bill on conservation, most of the work, a lot of the work we're doing on conservation and have done for a long time is climate smart, right? No-till, cover cropping have long been part of the suite of tools available through conservation. I know that's the buzzword of the day these days, but our conservation programs have already been climate smart. And so I do question, is the best approach to then add on new things or to just build on what we already have? And when you look at something like EQIP, right, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, super popular, but it's generally oversubscribed 2 to 1, right? We leave half of the applications on the table every year because we just don't have the funding to pay for them. And so is the smarter money on addressing the backlog and EQIP, on cost sharing, even if it is on climate smart things, cost sharing on helping growers, or is it creating new initiatives, in the name of climate smart? And so to me, there's an efficient middle ground somewhere in the middle of all of that, just in my opinion.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And you made a really interesting comment earlier about, because the Farm Bill is going to come up every 5 years like clockwork, it becomes this opportunity for, legislators to express whatever their priority is at the time. And hence there's a lot of baggage that comes with that. Now, I think you were saying that sort of in the context of what slows down the process of getting a farm bill passed. But is that also the case for why there's so much in the farm bill that doesn't end up with farmers? A lot of it is kind of food support programs, or was that always sort of the intention of the bill in the first place?
That dynamic on the food versus farm, and putting more, farm in the farm bill, goes back to the early 1960s, right, where the food stamp program was first authorized. And you have that alliance created even then, because even at the time, and I mean, now we're talking 70, going on 60, 70 years ago, you saw this recognition that increasingly Congress had fewer and fewer rural representatives. And so what we've progressively seen over time, though, is that has continued to grow, right? You have fewer and fewer representatives, fewer and fewer people involved in agriculture, to the point where, Title IV of the Farm Bill, the nutrition title, is 83% of the bill now. And when you start to think about it and break this apart, you have crop insurance. Again, it's permanent law, Federal Crop Insurance Act. And so what you're really moving in a farm bill now, and with the discussion we just had on the IRA, conservation programs were extended in the IRA. So really what we're talking about is Title I now. And it's the programs designed to support producers and to help keep, producers on the farm. And that's less than 5% of this entire farm bill. And so, I think it's fair for members to raise those questions of, is this balance right? I mean, do we have this right? And I'm not one of those who, I'm not a glass half empty kind of guy when it comes to Congress, because our system of government is supposed to be messy, right? I mean, democracy is, it's not neat and tidy. It's very messy with everybody involved. And our founders intended for the process in Congress to be very difficult to get anything done. So you don't have one individual who can shove something through Congress. And so I don't lament that side of it. But, the flip side of it too is, at some point, do we start to, ask the questions of, do we have the balance right? And, and that is my concern, is that with fewer and fewer people, involved directly in production agriculture who don't understand all the intricacies of it, it's easy to look at and say, well, what do we even need all of this stuff for? Well, there's some huge implications, tied into the answers of those questions. And I think Title I, crop insurance in particular, continue to remain incredibly important, but it is caught up in the swirl of all the politics that, it is just more partisan these days. In the past, agriculture, the ag committees used to be more regional battles, and certainly some of those are still there, but you do have these camps now where it tends to be more, I'm either with, in the rural America camp, or I am in the SNAP and nutrition funding camp. And I don't think that helps nutrition funding recipients. And I don't think it helps growers, right, to force everybody into those camps, because what we need is legislators who see the importance of both of those things, and revisit it with an open mind. But that's not necessarily the state of play these days.
Right. Boy, yeah. Well, so this is why it's hard to do kind of one podcast episode on the Farm Bill, right? Because there's so much complexity here. But I'm going to try my best. So, going back to what you've been saying about, hey, we've got permanent authorization for the crop insurance program in the 1980s and separate legislation. We've got Inflation Reduction Act, which really focuses on a lot of these conservation type programs. You're kind of down to, Title I, as you said, which is 5% or so of the Farm Bill. Does this make it so that the Farm Bill is maybe less relevant or less essential for the farm economy than it used to be?
Yeah, I think there's like most of these things, I think every answer I've given on here, there's multiple parts to it, right? I mean, I think it kind of depends on your perspective, right? And what is the purpose of Title I, for example? Because, I mean, we dealt with this in 2014, right? Prices were high. We don't, we can eliminate direct payments. We don't need Title I because prices are high. And I remember Mr. Lucas at the time saying, farm bills aren't written for the good times, they're written for the bad times. One of the challenges, though, is that even though they're written for the bad times, they're often written during the good times. And so, and I wouldn't necessarily universally say that right now is a good time, right? I mean, net farm income, is back up there, pretty high, but it hasn't been shared the same across all, crops and livestock. So for anyone listening who's not necessarily feeling like times are great right now, but in general, with net farm income where it is right now, I think it does just make it harder to get farm bills done. Policymakers aren't hearing it directly from the countryside. The concern I have with that, though, is we're not writing it for right now. In fact, I mean, and this is what makes farm policy these days much different than in the past, is that we're writing them in anticipation of what's going to happen over the next 5 years, and so we're writing it for what will happen in year 4 and year 5 of a farm bill. And what we learned coming out of 18 was that the levels weren't up to snuff, particularly in response to inflation, and so we're writing it right now in anticipation of 3 or 4 years from now. And to that question of whether or not it's needed, if you end up back in those levels, you find out really quickly that it will be needed. And some crops feel it more acutely than others. You don't have to convince a rice grower of that, for example. They know that very well. They're very much subject to the whims of the rest of the world, right? They have very little influence on global rice price, just given our posture in the world market. On the other end of the extreme, you take, a U.S. corn grower, for example, where we still are a major player, where we can still have an impact on price, where you're less likely to see these huge swings, right? It's that I can write it out. If I've got a short crop, prices are going to go up, right? We've heard that, a long time. But even there, you start to see things shifting, right? I mean, just look at the United States on corn vis-a-vis Brazil and where we are on export share. Last year, Brazil displacing the U.S. In terms of the largest corn exporter. And so even for corn growers, that dynamic is shifting. And so it's easy in isolation to sit here and say, well, with prices where they are now, we don't even need Title I. And my answer to that is, unlike 80 years ago, great, turn it all off, let it all turn off. The support will turn off. And that's how it's designed to do. But you also need it there, and you need it to turn back on if the situation inverts, right? And we end up in a price scenario south of where we are today. And so I actually think, the policy is designed to accommodate that. But again, the challenge is that when you're trying to write legislation in a time when the sky is not falling, it's hard to get Congress's attention. And frankly, it's hard to get rural America. I mean, you don't see a 1970s tractorcade driving to Washington, D.C. right now. But yeah, you do still see, I mean, folks are engaged. And again, back to Title I, it's playing out primarily in the context of a conversation on reference prices.
Mm-hmm. And I know I'm jumping back and forth here between like the structure and the content of the Farm Bill and the process a little bit, but kind of back on the process side more. So what happens right now if okay, it's clear we're not going to get a new Farm Bill passed? Do they have to pass an extension of the 2018 Farm Bill to buy them more time? What does that look like to avoid reverting back to the original legislation from the late 1920s?
Great question. And so, and I'm reluctant to paint with too broad of a brushstroke, right? Because there are let's take, one example. You take Title III of the Farm Bill, the trade title, where we do a lot of market promotion work around the world. One, market access program, we're promoting U.S. products into overseas markets. Foreign market development, we're using it we're using it for similar purposes, a little more focused on building capacity in those countries, tearing down technical barriers in those countries to be able to export more to those countries. Programs like that, there are more immediate implications of a farm bill expiring when it expired on September 30th. The funding for those, as long as they have baseline funding or a baseline budget, they're okay. And in that case, they do. They're not losing, their funding going forward, but it does affect their authorization to operate in the near term. Another one is a program that received money one time in a farm bill, in the previous farm bill. They're affected too, right? Because their funding ran out with the end of that farm bill. And so I don't want to paint too broadly and imply that there aren't, direct implications, because there are cases like that where they are. But if you look at the other side of the ledger, the conservation programs, again, back to the IRA, were already, by and large, were already extended. So that's not a concern. So then you're sort of left really looking to Title I of the bill and the so what. We got to September 30th. What happened on Title I, for example, ARC and PLC? Well, those programs run through the calendar year, or through the crop year, which is essentially the calendar year of harvest. And so those programs run through the end of December 31. Similar, on the dairy programs right now. And so the question then is, okay, well, when does it start to matter? And when it really starts to matter is, okay, well, at what point then do you revert? This, the 18 farm bills suspended permanent law for those 5 years. And so if programs like ARC and PLC run through December 31, then it's January 31 where you start to take notice. And so what happens on January 31 in those cases? Well, you revert back to the 38 and 49 acts. And it's back to parity pricing. It's really old school recourse price support loans at price levels that are on par with 1910 to 1914. And so those really start to kick in on January 1. Well, the first one that would matter to is dairy, because you have daily harvest, essentially, milking dairy cows. And so that's why if we get to January 1 without a farm bill extension, and I know that's all the discussion right now, if you get to January 1, you'll start to hear about the dairy cliff, because that's when you start talking about implementing permanent law for dairy. And so, you've got a window here. It's not that members didn't care that September 30th came and went. It's that no member who's trying to write a farm bill is eager to get, to talking about an extension, because they want to keep up pressure to get a farm bill done. But you start to get to the end of the year here. And I think what's complicating it this time is it's hard to get anything passed through Congress. And so you may only get one bite at the apple. We might ought to have a farm bill extension as part of that. And so I think that's probably driving the conversation, where you've seen a lot of the leadership now defaulting to doing a 1-year farm bill. I think that's probably the reason. And if you look back to the extension of the 08 Farm Bill, it was signed by President Obama on January 2nd of 2013, right in the middle of negotiating a farm bill then too. It was a year-long farm bill, and it didn't slow down passage. We ended up developing it all the way through 2013, and it was signed in early 2014. And so for those who are worried that if you do a long-term extension, it's going to slow down farm bill progress, it didn't slow down progress on the 14 bill one iota. We didn't even have to do an extension in 18. And so the last one we looked to is in 14, and that 1-year extension had virtually no impact on the timing of the process.
Let's zoom out a little bit and look to the future. From your lens, you're both, as you said, a policy nerd and an economist focused on agriculture and from a farm family. How do you see agriculture changing in the decades to come? What should we keep our eye on about where this industry is headed?
To some respect, I think it's the same that it's always been, in that, particularly production agriculture has always been hard. Farming and ranching have always been hard, not for the faint of heart. It doesn't necessarily reward. It can reward those, who put in the hard work and put the capital at risk. And I think the challenge today is that it is so incredibly risky, right? I was just, talking to one of our classes yesterday about risk in agriculture. And I grew up on a cotton farm. You want to go buy a new baler, cotton stripper, you're talking, and I'm probably even behind now, $900,000 to $1 million, just to buy a cotton harvester. And I mean, all the technology is fantastic, but it's extraordinarily expensive on a scale, that my granddad or great granddad, would have never believed possible. And so you've got, growers putting a huge amount of capital at risk. And so, I mean, I think the sky is the limit in terms of opportunity. I mean, I don't know of any other profession where you work as hard as you do in production agriculture, but if you're willing to put in the hard work and the sweat equity, I mean, I think there's going to be tremendous reward out there, if for no other reason than people need to continue to eat. But to get the backing to do that, I think, to me, farm policy is rather than being something we can get away from, I think it's more important now than ever, just because the risks are so high and there is so much money that growers have to put on the table. And if I look out a little bit further, one concern I have, which I'm not a Thomas Malthus, from the 1700s, 1800s, whatever it was in England, that we weren't going to be able to grow enough food to feed ourselves. I don't think that at all. I mean, we're a resourceful people and rise to the occasion. But the flip side of that is there are very, very few people involved in production agriculture. And that's something we watch very closely. And my argument is if we don't get farm policy right, we just exacerbate that problem even more, that there's going to be fewer and fewer and fewer people involved. And I do have a pretty significant concern with what all that portends for the future, particularly of rural communities. And so my argument is that you need sound farm policy, you need adequate access to capital, primarily through credit, and those kind of are the two major building blocks, and that it's incredibly important we get both of those right.
Well, I can't help it, but you just kind of opened up a can of worms here with 5 minutes left. But so we'll see what we can do here. But where in policy are we addressing that need for rural economies to bring new blood into agriculture and supporting young farmers? Is that part of the Farm Bill or any of these policies that we've talked about today?
Well, I'll endeavor for this to be a 5-minute conversation too, Tim. But one of the concerns I've had, in 20 years of working in this space and 40 of observing it, is that I don't know that we've lost sight of it, but I think we've underappreciated the importance of production agriculture in general, right? I mean, and if you look at all the work we do in rural development and all the other things we're going to bring to rural America, if we lose sight of the fact that those communities exist in a lot of cases exclusively because of the income generated by production agriculture. And so one of the concerns I have is, when we think we can keep rural communities vibrant and that we can simultaneously ignore agriculture, I think, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And there's still folks out there who I think flirt with that notion. And if you're on the edge, if you're a suburb of a major city, fine, I get all of that. But if you're a rural community like the one I grew up in, where you're not bringing in a factory or whatever to provide additional employment, agriculture is still the primary generator of economic activity. And I do think, the challenge is we can either foster that and support it, and if we don't, we do so at our own peril. And one of the things I've been observing that I think is concerning is that the solution I hear offered all of the time is, well, we've got to get, new people involved in agriculture. Great, 100% agree with that. The challenge is that almost always, depending on who, not universally, but often then I hear that piggybacked with, that, well, the focus and policy focus has to be on the small producer. And you see this undercurrent right now in Washington, D.C., the small grower versus the large producer. And then small is almost always equated with beginning and new. And so, ergo, to get people involved in production agriculture, we've got to be focused on providing resources to small and beginning, small and that's the same, presumably the same thing, producer. The challenge is, for commercial production ag, and for if you want to make a go of it full time as your full time occupation, we just talked about the equipment example earlier. You're investing millions of dollars in equipment, and you're farming a lot of acres then to be able to spread out that risk. And so, this focus on will provide new opportunities for small growers. What you're essentially saying in doing that is, okay, go find an off-farm job, and you probably won't find you won't necessarily find one in your local community unless it's also tied to agriculture. So go find a job and then we'll help you farm a little bit on the side. My concern is for the one who wants to do this full time. And so I think this small versus big argument is absolutely toxic. It's divorced from reality in rural America. And where you see it start to play out is on all these conversations, and this gets really wonky and in the weeds, but things like payment limits and actively engaged. Right now, we essentially say, hey, if you want access to the farm safety net, we're going to payment limit you, and you've got to prove that you're actively engaged in spending enough hours in a tractor seat. And I argue it's having the opposite effect that we want it to, that it's making it harder for young people to get involved back on the farm. Even if they grew up in it, it's hard unless they actually choose to move back and do it full time. And so I think we've got to rethink how we do a lot of that. And unfortunately, I just see more doubling down on the same policies that have gotten us into this mess in the first place. And so that one is an extraordinarily hot button issue that I'm under no illusion is going to be addressed anytime soon. But I think if we want to start to address some of these problems, we've got to start rethinking some of those issues.
All right. Well, we will end today's episode right there. Thanks for letting me squeeze in that little part at the end about rural economies. I think that's a really fascinating aspect to the future of agriculture I don't explore enough on this show. Thank you very much to Dr. Bart Fisher for being on the show. Thank you to my good friend Trent McKnight for connecting me to Bart. And thank you to all of you for listening to this show. Would you just do me a quick favor? And if you know of another ag nerd that might be interested in learning something about the Farm Bill, I hope you learned something. I know I did. I would love for your fellow ag nerd friends to also learn something about the Farm Bill. Would you just send them this episode? Just text this episode. Say, hey, check this out. I think it's worth your time. I really do appreciate all of you who continue to promote and share the show. I absolutely couldn't do it without you. Thank you to FarmWave for being our quarterly presenting sponsor. And as I always say, last but certainly not least, thank you for your time and your attention. I do not take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.